Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Bava Kamma Chav. We're going to start on the bottom of Chav Ches Amud Beis, around 8 lines from the bottom, that Mishnah had stated on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph on Chav Ches Amud Aleph at the bottom, a dispute between the Bava Kamma and Rabbi Yehuda. And let's say your jug breaks in public and somebody slips on the water, then, or the pottery, the Bava Kamma says you're chayev and you're liable. And Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, if it was your intent, you're liable. The miskaven chayev, the eno mischayev. But if it was not your intent, we're going to say you're exempt. The eno mischayev pater. So the Gemara says, what does this mean? What does Rabbi Yehuda mean here when he says this? Hechidami miskaven. When Rabbi Yehuda says, if it was your intent, you're liable if your jug slips. Amarabba b'miskaven lohorido lamata miksefo. He intended to take it, to basically take it down from his shoulder. Meaning he intended to use it in the normal manner. And then he's going to be liable. So the Gemara is going to say, well, where are you not liable? But first the Gemara asks, so Amalei Abaye miklal d'mechayev Rabbi Meir afilu nivshra. So this means that Rabbi Meir is going to say, you're liable, even if it just disintegrates on its own, it explodes. You're going to be liable according to Rabbi Meir. Gemara says, Amay in, yep, that's exactly the case. Mechayeva Rabbi Meir, afilu ozna biyadu. Even if the jug just disintegrates in your hand, you're going to be liable. The Gemara asks, why? Why does Rabbi Meir say you're liable under those circumstances? Am I onasu? Isn't he considered an ones? Meaning something that happens totally against his will or totally accidental. The ones rachmana patre, and when it comes to an ones, the Torah says you're exempt. So the Gemara explains, Dirsev, and how do we know you're exempt for an ones? Because it states onara rota sedavar. Because for an ara, you can't do anything. So, meaning to say that if a girl was assaulted, she's not responsible because she's an ones. And if you want to say, okay, you're exempt in the sense that if you're an ones, we're not going to execute you. With respect to damages, we're going to hold you chayav. We're going to hold you liable. Let's say we have a brisa which says something similar. Let's say your jug falls and you don't remove it right away, or nafal gemalo, or if your camel falls, you don't pick it up. Or Meir says you're chayav bezikan, chacham potter. And so we see from here, even in this case, that under these cases, Rabbi Meir is going to say you're liable in this case. So we see from here that the Chachamim say you're pater midine adam, or on the top of 29a. The Chachamim say you're exempt from the laws of man and liable b'chay b'dinei shemayim. So what's this case? We'll just say it again. Now, with respect, the Brisa says, let's say your jug breaks and you don't remove it, and your camel falls and you don't stand them up. Rameir says you're liable. This is consistent with the position of our Mishnah. Now, Chachamim say you're exempt from the laws of man, but you're liable from the laws of heaven. We're on top of 29a. Modim Chachamim or Rabbi Meir, Chav Tes Amud Aleph, and the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Meir that in the case of Ba'avno Sakino Maso, let's say you have this hazardous item, that you put it on the top of your roof, Vinaful Beruach Mitsuya, and then it falls off by a regular wind, Viziko Shu Chayev. That under those circumstances, if the rabbis say you acted negligently, that you basically put it on your rooftop and a typical wind took it and flew it off, then under those circumstances, you're going to be liable. Umoder Rabbi Meir lo Rabbanon, and Rabbi Meir is agreeing with the rabbis, but Malak and Kanan Alagag, where you just put a jug on the roof, Because your intent was to dry it. V'nafu b'rosh enu metzilia v'hiziko shu pater. The mayor says that, listen, if you put your jugs on the roof and it's an irregular wind and dries it off, you're going to be exempt. So we see from here that our mayor says in a case of a total accident, you're exempt. So how can you interpret our Mishnah on that? If it disintegrates, Rabbi Meir says you're liable for the damage a jug causes. So therefore, Abaye says, Elam Abaye B'tarti Pligi. Abaye says that the way we understand our Mishnah is that there's a two-way dispute in our Mishnah. First dispute is B'shas Nefila. If at the moment it falls, it does damage. The mayor says you're liable, and the Chacham say you're exempt. And then there's a second dispute. Upligi la'achar nefila. And then once it's down on the ground, if you don't move it right away, let's say you declare it ownerless, the mayor says you're liable, and the Chacham say you're exempt. Pligi b'shas nefila b'niskal posheh. They're arguing about whether or not if a guy trips while he's walking with something, are we going to basically consider him to be negligent? So Rabbi Meir's in a position, you're negligent if you trip, it's your fault, and therefore you have to pay the responsibilities. Say, or Rabbi Yehuda, that he's not liable there. And then they're also arguing in a case where after it falls down, the mafkir nizakav. Now let's say you have your hazardous item in public, your car breaks down in public, and you say, you know what, I don't want to get rid of my car, I'm just declaring it ownerless. And then another car, Rahman al crashes into it. So the mayor says you're liable if you just declare your object ownerless in public. Potter, whereas Rabbi Yehuda is going to say, or the Chacham will say you're exempt. So the Gemara says, umimai. How do we know that this is a two-way dispute between Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanon? So the Gemara explains me the Katani Tarti, from the fact that our Mishnah has two cases. It says Huchak Echa B'mayim. It says if you drop your jug and one person spills on the water, O Shalaka B'charsis, or one person got hurt by the shards. But but why would I have to say two cases? Aren't they the exact same thing? Elav, it must mean that this is what it's saying. If one person slipped on the water when it fell down, if one person slipped on the water when it fell down, or somebody. Or he got hit by the pottery shards after it fell down. Gemara says, the masnisim betarti, for the fact that our Mishnah must be referring to both cases. It must be that the Bryce is nami betarti. Then the Bryce, which talks about the camel and the jug of water, should also be referring to two cases. But that doesn't make sense because bishlam akado mishkacha. So I can understand how the jug could apply to both cases. B'shas nefila, achar nefila, that you could either get hurt by the jug in the moment it falls or after it falls. El gamalo, but his camel, how could that be applying to both cases? Bishlam achar nefila. I understand how if your camel drops in public and then you don't move it and somebody gets hurt on it. I understand mishkachasla. I understand how we could have that scenario. The mafkir nivelaso, where you abandon your carcass. But if it's how could you be responsible for while the camel's slipping? How's that your fault? How could that possibly be you being negligent? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you how. Could go into Avra B'maya Derech Sharata Denara. Well, let's say you basically went in a place you shouldn't have walked with the camel where there was flooding. Or so the Gemara says, well, if there was another path, you were negligent. If you had no other path, is obviously a total accident. The Gemara says, well, no, you tripped and then you caused your camel to trip. Okay. So the Gemara now says, Abaye had said it's a two-way dispute. One is where, what did we say about during the moment it falls, where Meir says you're liable, and the Chacham say, and Rabbi Yehuda says you're exempt. And then after it falls, if you want to declare it ownerless, or Meir says if you declare your hazard ownerless, you're not responsible, and the Chacham say, the Rabbi Yehuda says you are. The Gemara goes into that. Mafkir nizakav. Well, this position that you said that the second dispute is where he declared his hazard ownerless. The Rabbi Yehuda says you're liable there. But Rabbi Yehuda says if you had intent, you're liable. My miskavenika. But how does that fit in with the language of the Mishnah, where if you had intent? So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef, no, it means b'miskaven liskos becharse. If you intended to take back your pottery shards, meaning say you didn't declare it ownerless, so then you're going to be liable. Where does Rav Yehuda say liable? If you really didn't declare your hazard ownerless. Rabbi Elazar says, so Rabbi Elazar gives a different approach. Rabbi Elazar says the dispute in our Mishnah is b'shas nefila mechukas. What happens if it falls down? But after it falls down, what would we say? If after it falls down, whether or not you declare it ownerless or not, divrei hakol pater. We're going to say that even Rabbi Meir says it's exempt under those circumstances after it falls down, assuming you declared it ownerless. The Gemara says, but why? Doesn't Rabbi Meir say you're liable? My divrei hakol, what does it mean everybody says after it falls down? Chayiv. That even Rabbi Yehuda would say you're liable. The Gemara says, Rabbanan de Patri. But then we have explicitly the Gemara, the Brisa that says that in the Brisa it says explicitly that the Rabbanan say that if your camel falls in public and you don't move it, or if you have the jug in public and you don't move it, the Chachamim say you're exempt. So how could you say that everybody says you're liable? Elamai b'shas nefila. What does it mean when it says during the time of the nefila, during the time that it falls a dispute? It means af b'shas nefila. That even that there's a dispute after it falls down, if you declared it ownerless, whether or not you're responsible, and also during the moment it falls down, there's a dispute between Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanan or slash Rabbi Yehuda. The Kamachmo and Kedabaye, and Rabbi Elazar is telling us like Abaye that it's a double dispute during the time it falls down and also after it falls down. We're on the top of Chavtes Amabeis. The Rabbi Yochanan Amar. Rabbi Yochanan comes along and says that after it falls down, if you declare it ownerless in public, that's when there's a dispute. But during the moment it falls down, what would we say? Not only is Rabbi Yehuda saying it's pater, but even Rabbi Meir is saying it's pater. But how could it be that Rabbi Meir is saying it's pater? It can't be. From the fact that Rabbi Yochanan said later on, with respect to Mishnah. Now, what was this Mishnah later on? That Rabbi Meir says, and that Rabbi Yochanan says with respect to our Mishnah later on, Rabbi Meir, you can't interpret this Mishnah. That was a case where one person tripped and he fell into another person in front of him. And we say that the first person is liable for tripping into the other person. Don't say that this Mishnah is Rabbi Meir because the Amar Rabbi Meir Niskal Posheahu. Because Rabbi Meir says that Niskal is somebody who's negligent. So from the fact that when we get to that Mishnah, we'll see that that's how Rabbi Yochanan says, and we call it Rabbi Meir Mechayev. See, then in general, Rabbi Meir says somebody who slips is liable. Elamai, so what do you want to say? Divrei hakol chayev. Do you want to say that everybody says you're liable? It can't be. Rabbi Yochanan Kamar lo teim mastisim Rabbi Meir yidamar niskal posheu. We call the patri rabbanon. So it must be that the rabbanon say that if you trip and you damage someone, that you're exempt. So you can't say that everybody says it's exempt. The maskir nisak of the hacha, who the patri rabbanon the anasu. So this is what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. In this case, where you declare your object ownerless, like the camel fell, and then you said, I don't own it anymore. In this case, the rabbanon say you're exempt because it's a total accident. But if in general, if you declare your object ownerless, the rabbanon are going to say you're liable. It's just here because it was complete accident. That's where the rabbanon say you're going to be exempt. But let's say you made a pit in public and then declared it ownerless, or let's say you parked your car in a specific place and say I'm done with it. That's the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and the rabbanon, where the chachamim are but in general the rabbanon will say you're liable. So the Gemara says, okay, let's look at this dispute. Idmar mafkir nizakav Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar, Chad Amar Chayev, Chad Amar Potter. So let's say you declare your objects ownerless in public, your hazardous items. Rabbi Yochanan says, and Rabbi Lazar, one says you're liable, one says you're Potter. Leima Manda Mechayev. Do you want to say the one who says you're liable says your Chayev is like Rabbi Meir, Manda Potter Karabanan? So why don't we just say the one who says you're liable is like Rabbi Meir, and the one who says you're Potter is like the Rabbanan? The Gemara says no. Leima Manda Mechayev is Alibud Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Meir, Kuli Alma Pligi. Everybody would say. Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar would both say that Rabbi Meir says it's liable. There's no dispute there. Ali keep pligi. Where do they argue? Ali but the Rabbanan. They're only going to argue according to the Rabbanan who says it's potter. So man the potter, the one who says it's potter, if you make your object ownerless in public, they hold like the Rabbanan. Man the Mechayev, but the one between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar who says you're liable would say Amracha Ana da Amri Afilu Rabbanan. The one who says you're liable says this is a case where even the Rabbanan would say it's liable. Ad Kan Lo Patri Rabbanan. Where do the Rabbanan say you're exempt? The Mazkir Nezak of Da'acha Mishim Na'anasu, where it was a total accident from the beginning of a Mazkir Nezak of Da'alma Machayvi, but in a situation where from the outset it wasn't a total accident, you placed it there, then even the Rabbanan would say you're liable. So now we want to know which one of Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Yochanan is saying that the Rabbanan say you're liable in a case where you intentionally put it there. To stem to Rabbi Lazar, who Damar Chayev. So let's assume that Rabbi Lazar is the one who says that if you intentionally put your hazardous item in public and then you declare it ownerless, you're liable, even according to the Rabbanan. Number Rabbi Lazar Mishum Rabbi Yishmael, because Rabbi Lazar quotes Rabbi Yishmael who says, Shnei Dvarim Einan Bershusa Shel Adam. There are two things that are not technically a person's domain. So the Torah makes it as though it's in your possession, and therefore you're liable. What are these things? A pit in public, which it's not in your possession because you declared it ownerless, and chametz after 6 hours of the day, even though the chametz you're not allowed to own, meaning to say that you're not allowed to own it from the Torah, and it's not your domain. Nevertheless, the Torah says you're responsible for it, and so therefore the Torah says you're liable for Bal Yiro, Bal Yimatzi. Anyway, what we see from here that Rabbi Lazar says explicitly, even though it's not in your domain, you're going to be liable. So it must be the Rabbi Lazar is the one who says that the Chachamim say you're liable. Gemara says, "Umi Amar Rabbi Lazar Achi." Because Rabbi Lazar really be the one to say this in the name of Rabbi Shmuel. Amar Rabbi Lazar Ipchav. Doesn't Rabbi Lazar say the opposite? Because we have a case, we have a Mishnah, which we're God willing going to get to on tomorrow's daf. Hold on one second. We have the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us. Says the Mishnah that if somebody is flipping over the dung, they have dung that they used to leave in public. So he was flipping over the dung in public. Rishus Rabbim, the hizik bahen acher, and while he's flipping over the dung, he damaged somebody else. Chayav benisko, he's responsible. Rabbi Lazar says, only when is he liable? When he intended to acquire the dung. But when he didn't intend to acquire the dung, he's going to be potter. He's going to be exempt. So basically, somebody flipped over the dung, declared it ownerless because he left it in public. Somebody else slipped on it. Rabbi Lazar says, if he doesn't intend to acquire it, he's exempt. But if he intended to acquire it, he's liable. So we see from here, Alma Mafkir Nizak of Potter. So we see Rabbi Lazar saying that if you declare it ownerless after you picked it up, you're going to be exempt. So therefore, you picked it up, you acquired it, then you don't want it, you're going to be exempt. So isn't this the opposite of what Rabbi Lazar was saying above, where if you just declare your hazardous item ownerless, you're liable? So the Gemara says, no. No, why is Rabbi Lazar going to say you're exempt? Because you put it back in its original place. The Ravina says, wait 1 second. Ravina, Mashal to Rabada Bar Abba. What Rabada is saying that if you pick up the dung, acquire it, then put it back in its original place, Rabbi Lazar is going to say you're exempt. Now, what's that case like? Let's say you find a pit, a hazardous pit uncovered. So you cover it up. And then you go back and you uncover it. So there, we're going to say you're not liable because you returned it to its original status quo. So the first person who had the pit uncovered is liable. And so that's what this case is. So Amoy Marzucha, Breder, Amar Ravina, no, those two cases are not the same. Midame, the two cases are not the same. Hasam lo estalkul ma'aser rishon. In the case of the pit, you didn't undo the first status. You just basically covered it and then you uncovered it. So it's back to exactly what happened. Here, Rebbe Lazar is picking it up, flipping it, and then putting it back to its original place. So we undid the initial action. And so therefore, this is like a case of where you find a pit that's uncovered, vitima, utamama, v'chazer, v'chafra, and you filled it in, and then you redug it, this talkul ma'aserishon, v'kaimala bereshusa, that what happened there, that you actually undid the first one and you did it. And so anyway, we see from here that Rebbe Lazar would be saying the opposite, because here he's saying you're exempt because you declared it ownerless. So therefore, how do we explain how Rebbe Lazar is contradicting himself? In one case where he picks up the dung and then he flips it and then he puts it back, we're going to say under that case, Rebbe Lazar says he's exempt. And here you said the Rebbe Lazar says that if you have a case, a hazardous item in public that you declare ownerless, according to Rabbanan, you're going to be chayiv. So Amar Vashi, what we're talking about a case is he didn't really acquire it. Why? He never acquired it. He only picked it up less than 3 tefachim off the ground. And so he never really acquired it. And so therefore, that's the reason why Rebbe Lazar would say you're exempt. Because you didn't acquire the dung. So the Gemara says, V'taima, what's the reason why you're saying he didn't acquire it? So the Gemara says, so he never acquired it. So the Gemara says, so why are you forced to say the Rebbe Lazar is talking about a case where he picked it up less than 3 tefachim off the ground? And what's the reason? And so therefore you need to say that what's the reason that you're explaining the Mishnah that only when you intended to acquire it would you be liable. But if you didn't actually intend to acquire it, then you're not going to be responsible for it. Lukma, why don't we say that the Mishnah is talking about a case where the Mishnah is talking about a case where it's above 3 tefachim off the ground. Even though he doesn't intend to acquire it, he's still liable. So why does he have to give this forced reading of the Mishnah? So Amarava Masnisin Kashise. So the Mishnah is difficult because why does it have to say that he flipped it over? It could have just said he lifted it up. So we see from here, so we see from here everything that's less than, every time you use the word hafach, it means it was less than 3 tefachim. So basically, we've explained that our Mishnah is saying that Rebbe Lazar says, if in general, if you have your hazardous item and you abandon it in public, you're still liable according to the Rabbanan. So the Gemara says, "We mean the Rebbe Lazar Amar." The Rebbe Lazar Amar Chayev, Rebbe Yochanan Amar Pater. The fact that Rebbe Lazar says you're liable, you declare your object ownerless in public, according to the Chacham, it must be the Rebbe Yochanan says you're Pater. But how could that be? Does Rebbe Yochanan really say you're Pater? As we're again going to see in tomorrow's Mishnah. Somebody who tries to basically bury their thorns, their hazardous items, their glass, or you make a hedge of thorns, or the offense that fell into public, and somebody else was damaged by it, you're responsible. When are you responsible? If it juts out into public. But if it's exactly the case, Potter, you're exempt if it's flush with your territory. My time Potter. Why are you exempt if it's mitzamtzem? Isn't it because isn't it because it's a pit in your own domain? And we see from here, so we see from here that if you have a pit and it's in public, you're liable. Alma mafkir nezakav chayiv. We see from here that according to Rabbi Yochanan, if you declare your pit onerous in public, you're liable. Gemara says no. Well, olam emochem mafkir nezakav pater. Rabbi Yochanan would say if you declare your pit in public domain, ownerless, you're going to be exempt. Mitzamtzem my time a potter. So if it's flush with your fence, why are you exempt? Why are you exempt? Mishum de idmarla, because we said Amar Rav Acha B'Reid Rav Iko Fisha Ein Darkan Shel Bnei Adam L'Slachat Putzon, because people don't usually rub themselves against the walls. Gemara says, "Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi." So does Rabbi Yochanan really say that for a pit in the public domain, you're going to be exempt? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Halacha Kastam Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan says the law is like an anonymous Mishnah. V'atanan Achofer Barbershus Haravim. If you dig a pit in public, that you're responsible if an animal falls in the pit and dies. The Gemara says, "El Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayev." Rabbi Yochanan says you're liable if for a pit in the public domain, even though you declared it ownerless. Rabbi Yochanan Amar chayev, and the fact that Rabbi Yochanan says it's ownerless, Rabbi Lazar says you're potter. But how could that be? I'm a Rabbi Lazar, Didn't Rabbi Lazar say in the name of Rabbi Shmuel that you're liable for your pit in the public domain, even though you declared it ownerless? Gemara says, "Lo kasha," on top of Lamed Amid Aleph. Hadidei Hadirabi. Yeah, that's Rabbi Lazar citing Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says you're going to be liable, but Rabbi Lazar himself says you're exempt. So we see from here that even if you have a pit in the public domain and you declare it ownerless, that's not enough. That's your hazardous item that you put into public. You're responsible for it. You're chayav for it. And that's the position both of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, and that's the halacha. Okay, we'll stop the recording here. It's such a big mechaya to see everybody here on the daf, on the recording, and in person. We shkoyach.